So we saw cloud computing first started to see its way into the enterprise. There was a lot of reticence, particularly from the security community, around moving things to the cloud and the risks associated with that. I think we've seen a pivot over the past few years of if you put something in the cloud and you've gone to the effort of leveraging an Azure security control, etc., and then later you retrospectively look back and go, well, what would happen if we tried to build that on-prem? You might not want to have that conversation. That's probably going to be very expensive. Hello and welcome to this episode of Strive. I'm Darren Thomson, and this episode is part of our series on data and digital sovereignty, where we explore that topic and what it actually requires architecturally, legally, and strategically. And we're going to do that in these episodes, one question at a time. I'm joined today by a very special guest. Thomas Maurer is Microsoft's EMEA Global Black Belt in Sovereign Cloud. He's in the room when CIOs and executives are making real decisions about how to build for sovereignty. Thomas, first of all, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Darren, for having me.
So let's start, in the interest of time, with the basics, and we'll get pretty deep pretty quickly. But I want to get into what does it actually mean for organizations that are new to all of this? What does it mean to design for data and digital sovereignty from your perspective?
No, excellent question. And I think having now these conversations almost like last year and over the last months and so on, I have to say things develop rather fast, right? There is different scenarios you want to actually cover and we have to discuss. And there's common themes, but then there's also, everyone is slightly different. So sovereignty doesn't necessarily mean the same to everyone, right? We still have this definition inside Microsoft, what we look at digital sovereignty and how that looks like and a phrase for it. But I tend to say kind of like to customers, hey, we're changing our view on this quite drastically. And we're saying, hey, sovereignty for Microsoft is what sovereignty means for the customer, right? Because again, like for some customers, this means just data residency. For some customer, it means following certain regulations, right? They have and certain policies they need to follow. And then we have others where they're looking at real business continuity and resiliency challenges where they say, hey, what do we need to do if there's some geopolitical conflicts and so on? And so these things all come together and they're all basically under the sovereignty umbrella. And it's interesting to learn from different customers what they actually need to design for, and then also help them think a little bit further about the other concepts as well, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So talk me through, my understanding is in your role and in your team's role for Microsoft, you're engaging at the executive level typically, and you're engaging very early, I would imagine. So this topic has come up, it's turned into a strategic imperative of some description. How do you first walk an executive team through the decision-making processes that they're about to embark on?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things. Like from a Microsoft perspective, and we'll talk about the Microsoft solutions and what we do a little bit later on. We have obviously different things to consider. First of all, we need to identify with the customer or with the execs, what are you looking for? Like, what does sovereignty mean to you, right? Why are you asking us about this? And we are really trying to understand, hey, what is the specific designs you need to make? And then from a Microsoft perspective, I'm covering a lot of the technical part on this, right? When it comes to real technical solutions, we talk about with them, hey, this is how you could address this specific request using technology. Now, technology is not always just it's not just pure technology answers. There's a lot of like legal answers we need to give as well to really create clarity on who has access to our data, the customer's data, when is there an access to the customer's data, who is operating these data centers, and so on. And so there's also a lot of conversations where we have legal teams in our coordination, and we have a role inside Microsoft, which is called the National Technology Officer, or NTOs. And usually we're also supported by them, which again do a little bit on the political and legal offering as well, depending on the specific countries as well, in geo regions, right? And so this is really how we start the conversation, is to figure out what is the concerns you have and how do we as Microsoft address these. Sometimes it's just like regulatory things, but then sometimes there is a technology need as well, right?
Yeah, interesting. So it sounds very consultative, and it sounds like, one size doesn't fit all in any cases. And also expect the unexpected, I suppose. Sometimes this comes from regulation, sometimes it comes from politics, sometimes it comes because you're in a certain region or you're dealing with a certain type of data. I guess it sounds like there's a lot of listening to do at the beginning of the journey as opposed to preaching and designing from there. So in that kind of phase, Thomas, what's the most common misclassification or mistakes that you see where organizations think they're solving a challenge, but they're actually not?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple things. I think we could make 1 hour of just talking about things we need to think differently and which we need to consider. I think a look at the challenge also for customers is most often they are not necessarily looking at sovereignty as a whole, right? They have this one specific thing in mind and that's for them sovereign. And that's okay. That's something we need to solve for. But at the same time, it's sometimes dangerous to just focus to solve this because there is sometimes also other things you need to look around. And so that is also a little bit of our responsibility to help them with the learnings we had with others, right? So, for example, we have these business continuity discussions, right? So I take like one example. So when we look at Microsoft, we have these kind of like high level, we identified these 5 key scenarios for digital sovereignty. So one is regulatory requirements, one is sovereign AI, another one is cloud operator access, data residency, and then business continuity. And the last one, I think, just take this as business continuity as an example. Very often we start the conversation in terms of, or the customer starts the conversation is, hey, what can we do around like kill switch scenario, right? We have, especially in Europe, this whole scenario where they're looking at this and saying, what if for some reason US companies need to somehow stop services or something like that? And right, I mean, it's a very highly unlikely, but again, a scenario they need to prepare for. And so they think that business continuity is like, okay, we bring stuff back to on-prem. And again, obviously we see in some cases, it's a fair point to make, and we obviously have solutions in that space. But I often then switch the conversation and also try to understand for them as well that with cloud, you gain a lot of business continuity, right? There's a lot of resiliency the cloud gives you. And I bring examples from other regions in the world where we see it's not about isolating data and bringing everything back, but also having the options to move things out of the country, right? Out of the region. I think that is something where we really see scenarios today where this is happening, right? And I think without the cloud, really, that would not even be possible for many companies and organizations. And so that is one of the things I realize a lot in the last few months and conversations I have, this one view, right, of things. And that is something we need to address and basically open it up to the broader conversation as well. We're still addressing this as well, right?
I think that's often my experience. It's often been the case where, for whatever reason, organizations are moving quite quickly ahead with a strategic initiative. I remember GDPR being a good example of this. The temptation is to rush forward without the proper analysis of what do we mean by good here? What objective are we trying to fulfill? And so taking that breath in many cases, I guess, is a good idea. So you mentioned some of the sort of advantages of cloud, for example. Let's go a level down a bit more into sort of architecture where you and I live sort of day to day, Thomas. Now, I'm not the expert that you are here, but I am consulting for Commvault with customers in this area. And something I'm hearing a little bit about are the differences between basing our sovereignty solution on public cloud offerings versus when things really have to be private. There's some sort of national imperative or something means that this has to be private cloud of some description or even on-prem. So talk us about that. Like, when does one skip to another? How do people make those decisions architecturally? What does that start to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is, again, a lot of conversations also I'm having with customers there as well. So when we look at the Microsoft cloud, right, when we look at this offering, we have something like what we call the Microsoft Sovereign Cloud. And this is not a product you purchase or something like that. That's just our Sovereign Cloud offering. And just to get started with this, we look at this kind of like as a 3-pillar model. So we have the first pillar, which is our what we call the Sovereign Public Cloud. Now, the sovereign public cloud is not, and that's very important, it's not a separate cloud from the other things we have, right? Basically, what our philosophy is, we want to build sovereignty right into the cloud everyone is using, like kind of like sovereign by design, sovereign by default. I tell always customers like, hey, there are things we're building into the platform which you get for free, basically, which means things like you think about like data boundary in Europe so that data doesn't leave Europe. And there's a couple of other things we're doing in the background with Data Guardian, which is basically defining who does the operations of these data centers and regions. And then we add these sovereign controls the customer can use. Think about encryption, confidential computing, key management, all these technologies so they can really protect their data. So that's the public cloud part. And then we have obviously a strong partner ecosystem, which is the third pillar, I would say, where we work with partners which do consulting, which do also offer clouds based on Microsoft technology. And there's a few others adding the services to it. And then the middle one, we talk about is the sovereign private cloud. As you already mentioned, private clouds and so on is where we really have these environments where customers need to run data on premises for various reasons. Could be data residency, operational control, or strictly air-gapped and completely disconnected environments as well, right? Where we want to have zero part of that. And what I've realized lately, these conversations now again, these are like pillars, right? But the idea is not that they are separated. Basically what end up, customers are using multiples of those. And it's really becoming a workload mobility discussion. Is like, hey, can I move in case of something, this application and data from one place to another, either within the public cloud or from private to public and public to private and so on. So that is really starting the conversation around this. What I've seen so far and what we're like, where we are heading. And we want to try to obviously make this as easy as possible as Microsoft in terms of using the same control planes, using the same management technologies, using the same application deployment options and the same services. And I think that is something I've seen. And then also, again, working with Commvault as a partner, right? We are also looking at how can we take partner technologies such as Commvault to move between those different parts of the world and protect them as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And thanks for bringing the Commvault solutions into the frame. And that kind of leads me to the next architectural question, really, which is obviously what we're focused on is cyber resilience. We were focused on understanding data, governing that data, protecting that data, and very importantly, bringing that data back, cleanly should the worst happen. I'm aware of the Azure local disconnected operations model that you have. These are those situations where it absolutely needs to be private. Back in the day, I would have called that a dark site, I guess. So what does that operating model that's kind of fully air-gapped change about the things that Commvault are focused on? So data protection and recovery and things of that nature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think also for those who haven't really known what Azure Local is, right, to just give them a little bit of an idea, it's really where you deploy our infrastructure part of what we need in the sovereign private cloud. So we're working there with our OEM partners for different scale sizes, from small form factor up to super large multi-rack deployments. Then have our software-defined data center stack, which allows you to run VMs, do networking, availability in terms of high availability within the cluster and things like that. And then bring these cloud services to life, right? In the past, you talk about disconnected, right? In the past, we just had an option where the control plane to manage this was Azure, right? And that's great in many cases, and many customers love that they can log into the same Azure portal, use the same Azure APIs to then also deploy on premises. But we had then customers telling us, hey, we have these sites where we completely need to be disconnected, where we don't want any connectivity, where we want to be completely air-gapped as well, and just want to make sure that there is no cloud access, even in a technology way, right? And so that is what we built with Azure Local Disconnected Operations. And that's kind of like where we basically took the subset of the control plane, meaning the portal, the APIs, the management services, and put them in an appliance VM the customer can deploy on premises and then connect their Azure Local clusters to that control plane. And so from a management perspective, when you look at things like Commvault and the integration of those, if they integrate into the Azure control plane in the current Azure Local connected environment, they will be still able to exactly use the same technologies and the same behaviors to also do that in a disconnected environment as well, right? Even though it's disconnected, we still want to give the customer the same experience, right? You're still opening up, let's say, a portal. It will be the same look and feel as you have in Azure. If you use APIs, they will be still working the same way. They will have a different address, but they will work in the same way. And so same thing for these partner solutions, right, where we see the integration as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. What I'm taking away from this is that not only does one size not fit all, and we have to be necessarily consultative before recommending any solution to an organization, but within an organization itself, one size doesn't fit all. Different data sets, application environments, etc., are going to require different levels perhaps of sovereignty and different types of architecture. And so it's important to be flexible in that regard. But of course, that would lead to huge complexity, and cost and risk if the control planes that you were using were different in every case. So it's important to have that, the consistency of Azure, the consistency of, the Commvault architecture, for example. That sounds sort of quite important. And then if we go one level down again, Thomas, in terms of where you see technical teams moving from design to deployment in whatever that might entail, what are some of the common mistakes that you see there? We've got a great design. We think it's fit for purpose for this particular use case in this particular organization. The technical team take over. What goes wrong in deployment?
So this is a good point, right? I mean, there's a lot of teams are building these solutions. And I think I want to go back one thing you just mentioned. As you just said, as a whole, there's no one size fits all approach, but also when you design these solutions and architecture these solutions, there's also not one size fits all. So there's different options. And when you just look at Azure Local for now, for example, not even talking about the whole public cloud as well, there's different deployment options on what you need, right? You need to talk up with the customer. Do we need to go disconnected, or is connected the better option? Or do we need both? Like it could be scenarios where you have both environments, right? Do we need to be able to switch between those? What types of redundancy, what do I want to build, and so on? So there's a lot of conversation around these which need to be clear. And I think that is also where these mistakes, I would say, or challenges come in, is like, you need to have some experience of building this. It's not that we're seeing that this is something everyone can build. Like sometimes we make things look so easy to do, and we try to, take away a lot of the complexity. But if the design is done wrong, or you don't consider certain things, you're going to build something which will not address your challenges, right? Where you at the end you say, okay, this is wrong. And then there's also challenges in terms of like what I see a lot, and this is maybe an industry specific problem, is like, hey, we have all these people who worked so much on cloud, and this is all great. But now we also need to focus, not just on the cloud part, but also on the infrastructure side again. For some customers, that's not a problem because they still have people who have to have the skills. But on the other hand, like some of these customers are now, okay, who is taking care of this? Who is doing this, right? Do I still have the people with that skill set? So that is already very specific, obviously. But I think that is a very important part same thing when we started with companies moving from on-prem to cloud, we had to build the skill set for the cloud. Now not because we're shifting back, but they're also building like buckets in this hybrid world, right? To figure out, okay, I need to have the skills there as well. And I think that is something I see when you ask about things which go wrong. It's mostly like, I did not have the skills and I did not try to get the skills inside, right? And then you made some wrong decisions there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the implication there isn't, I guess, just that you missed the mark in terms of the project objectives, but you get burnt later because you've burnt in architecture that was wrong from the start. And we all know that architecture then grows, it becomes more in demand, and very, very hard to fix retrospectively, which we've seen again and again in IT over the years. I want to, Thomas, to sort of end, cut back out of the weeds a little bit, back up to the executive level, because my experience in this so far is I see a lot of businesses at the executive level strive for some sort of contractual agreement, legal frameworks, etc. And of course, they're incredibly important. But realizing later that actually, to many of the points that you've been making, a lot of this is architectural. We've got to design this right with all of that flexibility that you mentioned. So talk to me a little bit about, so far we've built our sovereignty strategy on contractual assurances rather than architectural controls. Where do those executives start to kind of put that right? What's the right first thing for them to do as they try to correct that position?
I think this is what I just also wanted to add to the thing before, right? There's so much on the technical side, there's so much integration you need to do when you do something on-prem. And then if you just move up on that, what you just mentioned, there's also a lot of integration you need to do between, again, legal contractual agreements, the business side of the things, and then the technology, right? So really everyone needs to work on this together. And I think it's very important that when you start with this, that you look at it from all these different angles, right? I mentioned first, obviously, find the sovereign use cases or scenarios you want to address, but then also look at it, okay, so how do we address these, right? What are the answers I need to deliver? And in some cases, these are answers they need to deliver to their boards, right? We get there like the execs and they say, hey, actually, we are super fine and happy how we work with the Microsoft Cloud and all that, and we're using it for years and it's perfect. But we got these questions from the boards. What do you do if a certain case hits, right? Or what is your answer? And then that is where we need to come in and talk about on the contractual side of things, what is Microsoft doing to protect your data and give you clear answers? And we are very transparent with that information. And so, for example, we have the trust center and so on, so everyone can access those things. But we also, again, have these conversations with customers and tell them how we actually operate. And then again, it goes then from this to then also basically give them the right tools in place, right? There is some stuff where you can have a conversation with someone and tell them, look, contractually, we're doing all this. But especially in this geopolitical climate, some customers tell us it's great, but what if they just don't care about this and there's something just happening, right? And so that is where I say always, hey, that's where we have the great technology solutions we have to help you with this. And then like this can go from encryption technologies to protect the data. Like, again, this is always what I recommend when customers are afraid that Microsoft could hand out some data and so on. I mean, again, there's a lot of contractual agreements, processes in place and so on to not do that. But I always say, hey, if you want to make sure above that, then see that your data is encrypted, right? Because we are not decrypting data in that space. And those kind of things are very important. And the same thing also then with having these on-prem services as well, right? It's less about that people are afraid that Microsoft access the data because they see today that security is a massive challenge on-prem, right? Like to do that. I mean, also in the cloud, but especially if you then do everything again by yourself, it's going to be very, very tough. And so that is also something where we look from that angle and we want to deliver a secure solution and give you the right tooling and tell you how to do it. And most of the time they look at this as a kind of business continuity plan option as well. So again, for customers who really want to learn about this, it's important to check our documentation with all the details to know what is actually in the contracts, right? There's a lot of things we are doing. We speak with our legal teams, with our NTOs and so on to understand like how this actually works.
Something you mentioned there, Thomas, triggered a thought in me, which is that and we're seeing this a lot in our cyber resilience projects, not just sovereignty projects, actually, but just in general, is taking this kind of risk-based approach to these projects. So really taking a step back to, number one, think about the preferred risk posture of the organization. You know, I'm lucky enough in my role that I've worked with Formula One racing teams and local government organizations. They have a completely different attitude to risk. And that matters. The way we define how much risk we want to take matters down the line. But then also, going through a few scenarios and working out, okay, well, what are the things we're concerned about? Is it Microsoft giving our data away to a government or something? And if we are concerned about that, what's the right mitigation strategy for that based on our preferred risk posture? Maybe that's a risk we're prepared to take, or maybe it's a risk we share, or maybe it's a risk we mitigate, in which case we encrypt heavily, you know. So I think it's taking that risk-based approach is really key in these sorts of projects, I think.
Absolutely. I'm happy you bring this up, right? It really becomes this risk management part. And we had this sovereignty summit in Brussels a few months back where we basically showed exactly that approach, right? There's always, with doing certain things, trade-offs, and you need to know what the trade-offs are, right? And again, what is the thing I want to address and how do I mitigate it is super critical in this world. You also want to make sure there's maybe things you want to mitigate, but they probably open up other risks as well. When you look at the cloud, what terms of security the cloud can offer, do I really want to see that this all gone? Is that a risk I want to take? Or how can we address this, right? And I think we have good solutions to help also in hybrid environments and so on to address that, or disconnected environments. But still, people need to understand that, again, as you said, there's a lot of risk assessment which needs to be done. And I love that. I love this conversation. That is when you realize you're on the right path, is when you start talking about these risk management scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing also architecturally, I see a lot of be careful what you wish for. So we saw cloud computing first started to see its way into the enterprise. There was a lot of reticence, particularly from the security community, around moving things to the cloud and the risks associated with that. I think we've seen a pivot over the past few years of, well, actually, if you put something in the cloud and you've gone to the effort of leveraging, an Azure security control, etc., and then later you retrospectively look back and go, well, what would happen if we tried to build that on-prem? You might not want to have that conversation. That's probably going to be very expensive. You're not going to get the economies of scale that you would in the cloud. And so I see a lot of CISOs shifting their mindsets a little bit in that regard now. I could talk to you forever on this, and clearly you have the knowledge to allow us to do that. But if you could leave the audience for Strive here with one thing that you wish more IT executives asked before choosing the right model and strategy for sovereign, what would that be?
I really think that identifying the sovereign scenarios and then going into a risk management approach to basically address what's going on, I think that will help. The earlier you do that in the process, the better the outcome will be, and you will be faster to that desired outcome as well, right? Because otherwise you're going to turn in circles and so on. And so I think doing that, having that conversation, I think having that as early as possible, of course, will definitely help. What you brought up with the risk management as well, I think that is the key part there.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. And look, we really appreciate you being on this episode with us. Your knowledge and expertise is obviously sought after for good reason. And hopefully the audience today got a lot from that. If I were to summarize the things I would take away from this conversation, I think the risk-based approach thing is very important. You just re-articulated that. I think expertise is key. We are often compelled to try and do as much as we can on our own. I think thinking about our partner relationships across the board here is incredibly important with a strategic initiative like this one. I think one size doesn't fit all. Really heavily assess and consult around what does the business actually need here? And again, taking that risk-based approach to what's actually necessary and designing for that as opposed to designing on assumptions. And then lastly, I picked up a piece earlier in the conversation around stakeholders, who we have around the table when we start this conversation. This cannot be just a legal conversation. It cannot be just a compliance conversation. It cannot be just an architectural conversation. It's all of those things. And so that team that you mobilize, I think, to start these initiatives is really, really key. Listen, Thomas, thank you again for being with us. For everybody else, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Strive. Please do visit readyverse.com to go and have a look at our sovereignty readiness report, amongst other artifacts as well. But with that, I will leave you and I'll see you in the next one.